Hey guys, this is Russ. I wanted to put a little video together for Steve. I know he said he was using Cubase to do this. He was trying to figure out how to put drums and bass over an acoustic guitar and vocal recording that had already been made in free time without a click track reference. But I think this is a really good technique. I think this particular technique in Ableton is faster and produces better results than the comparable techniques in Cubase or Nuendo or Logic or Pro Tools. The first thing I've done is chosen a song here. I was going to use Ray LaMontagne's Burn off the Trouble album. To the best of my knowledge, it's the only song on that album that wasn't recorded with Ethan Johns. It was a demo, and I think it was recorded on a Portastudio or some kind of low-grade tape recorder. So in addition to some natural tempo variations, there's also some wow to deal with, and it seemed to me like kind of a worst-case scenario for what you might have to conform. It is in 3/4, so I went ahead and changed my time signature to 3/4, but other than that, I haven't really changed anything. It's also up-converted from an MP3 of relatively low quality, so I apologize for the quality of the audio, but it should suffice for this example. So I'm going to go ahead and lay it out on my timeline. I'm going to start it at bar 5 so that I have a little bit of space in the header there. More on that in a minute. But the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use Live's tap tempo feature to get in the ballpark. So I had ballparked it at 101.48, just clicking along with it, and I had actually prepared another session before doing this, and it was right around 100 beats per minute, so that's pretty close. So down here in the clip settings, you can see that we are not yet in warp mode, but now that we've gotten somewhat close to the tempo of the song and we're in the right meter, which is 3/4, I'm going to go ahead and put this into warp mode, and all of a sudden, we have all of these, for those familiar with Ableton, you'll see all these suggestions for warp markers, and then it's against the background of a grid. We see the audio superimposed over an absolute timing reference in the back there, which is the grid. Now, the analysis file for this clip did have the time signature correct already in it, which is 3/4 time. That has to match the time signature of our overall of our project here in order to get the best results. But that was not in there by default. It was wanting it to be 4/4, so I had to change it to 3/4. And then, other than that, all I've done so far is just turn on the warp button here, so I could get the warp background on the grid there. The first steps usually is to establish your downbeat. I'm going to go ahead and double click and nail down that warp marker. That's bar 1, beat 1, and if I right click on the warp marker, I get the option to set 1.1.1 here. That's set bar 1, beat 1, tick 1 here. And you can see immediately the timeline offsets. And then you might have noticed also the waveform up here has offset and moved to the very beginning of this clip, which is on bar 5 of the overall project timeline. If we zoom in on that, we can see it actually starts right in the middle of that waveform there, and we've got a little bit of a header, which is good. That's what we want. We want to retain every bit of the every aspect of the original file, including the total duration. We're going to come back to that once we create a click track in Ableton. But for now, we've got bar 1, beat 1, tick 1 starting exactly on a downbeat, and from here we can start to double click on the transients and nail these down to the bar lines. Now, what I'm doing now, because I'm just in standard warp mode, is I'm actually stretching or distorting the audio, pushing and pulling it to make it conform to the bar and beat lines. But there's another way to do this. Any one clip at a time in Ableton can serve as the master. And that means that the audio plays back unchanged, and the warp markers are used to dictate tempo changes to the Ableton transport, to the tempo track. And so rather than pushing and pulling and stretching the audio to conform to a fixed grid, we are pushing and pulling the grid to conform to the audio, but it looks exactly the same as when we're pushing and pulling the audio against the grid. I'm going to click to slave mode, and we'll click to master mode rather. It lights up yellow as master, and then immediately we see the tempo grayed out here, and then the red dot on there, or the orange dot, whatever it is, in Ableton that's used to indicate that there is automation. And if we go to the master track and we check out the mixer and the song tempo, we can see that we already have a couple bits of tempo automation in there based upon the the warp markers that we've created. And the way I like to go through this is I usually just turn the click track on, and I like to take a couple different passes. The first pass, I try and get as close to real time as possible. So I'm just going through here, and I'm focusing on downbeats. And it's going to sound a little stiff in parts because there's going to be some rubato within the bars, in between the downbeats. But we'll go back and we'll nail that down on a second pass. The ultimate goal here, if we're trying to put drums and bass under this, is to make it feel as though the drummer is driving the tempo and the singer and the guitar player is sort of feeling that out. Sometimes they're hitting it right on the downbeat, but sometimes there's a little wiggle room, maybe, you know, a slow down or a speed up at the end of the phrase or a turnaround. So I'm going to go ahead and play back the transport and work through a couple bars of this. I did have it completely worked out in a different session, so I'm just going to kind of show you how I go through this in real time. I'll go back and clean it up a little bit, and then we'll jump over.
Oh, mama, don't walk away. I'm a goddamn soul loser. I ain't too proud to say that I'm still thinking about you. I'm so lonesome without you. I can't get you out my mind. Oh, mama.
Okay, so that's the first verse or so of the song. And you can see I kind of jumped around. Sometimes it was every bar, sometimes it was every 2 bars. But that is a somewhat passable first attempt at getting a tempo map. You can see if we look at the global tempo track here, you can see that it increases a little bit in the intro, comes back down, and then remains a little bit more steady through the vocal part of the verse, but it does pick up steam a little bit as we get to the instrumental turnaround at the end of the phrase there, and we're going into the second half of the verse. So the next thing I would do is go back to the beginning and just sort of listen, and I'm listening to the click against the guitar and the strumming of the guitar, paying attention mostly to the downbeats, but I don't want it to sound too off in between. At the same time, I don't want to get too precise here and do every single quarter note, because that's going to again defeat the purpose of making it sound in the end result as though the drummer or whatever rhythms we program are driving the pulse of the song, and Ray in this case is just sort of laying over the top of that. We want it to sound as though the drummer were part of the original performance. And to my ears, I know there were several people that suggested that you just hire a good drummer and have him play along. In my experience, that's not going to produce as good a results as using this technique to develop a precise tempo map or a click track that drummer can have in their ears to use as a secondary timing reference to drive the pulse of the song, so that he's not always following that step behind. He's always going to be reacting to the performance if he has to listen to it and follow along. And there are certain portions of the song where the drummer's he's going to come in a little bit ahead of the beat on an accent, on a downbeat, on a fill and a crash. I don't think, in my experience, it's possible to do that as well when you're just playing along to the original performance. It's easier if you have, the click track and the timing reference. So we'll go back to the beginning, and I'll just tighten this up a little bit through the first few bars, and then I'll jump over, and we'll actually hear a programmed rhythm on top of that. And so at bar 3 right there on that downbeat, it sounded to me like things got off a little bit there. And if I'm looking at the waveform, as much as I hate to EQ and do dynamics visually, it's very helpful to use the waveform display here. I can see that the waveform is actually coming in a little bit before the downbeat of the tempo. So that's going to put the click track a little bit behind. It's going to sound like the guitar is rushing there. One of the reasons I prefer to edit these hit points versus the comparable techniques in Pro Tools or Logic or Cubase for generating a tempo map is that if I want to fudge this a little, I just hold down the Option key, click on the hit point, the warp marker, and I can just very precisely and you can see up there in the MIDI track what it's doing to the automation. To me, that's just a lot more intuitive of a way to do it than it is to try and edit hit points and tempo changes in Cubase or Logic or in Pro Tools. I know you can get it done, but to me, this is just a much faster way to get through here. So we can take a listen back to that and see if I made it any better. And to my ears, that does sound a little bit better. So that's the way you would go about that. I would do 2 passes, one through the whole song, and try and do it as close to real time as possible. Every 2 bars, we'll probably do it, and then go back in and fill in the gaps. I'm going to jump over to the other session right now, so the audio is going to cut out for just a second. Okay, we should be back up. So what I've done here is I will give you an overview of the clip. I have done a whole lot of hit points through here. I did a couple passes. Took me about, I don't know, between 10 and 15 minutes to do it. But the result is that we've got a pretty convincing tempo map here. I'm going to turn the click track on and just play it for a few minutes. Actually, I'll jump ahead in the song. Now, it is going to sound a little bit stiff in places, and that's because partially because the tempo is, or the click track is perfectly quantized. There's no groove to it. There's no feel to it. And also because the sounds themselves are very percussive, they're highly transient. They're going to stick out of the mix. To the ears are going to be able to pick them out of the mix as something separate that doesn't gel with the guitar and the vocals. But I think when we put the programmed rhythm in there, it's going to feel a lot better. It's going to have a little bit of groove quantization on it, and it'll feel a lot more like a singular performance rather than 2 separate elements of click and the guitar. But for reference,
Goddamn soul loser, I ain't too proud to say that I'm still thinking about you. I'm so lonesome without you. I can't get you out my mind.
and you can see up here at the top left, the tempo changes happening in real time.
Don't leave me alone. My soul shut down.
But to me, that's pretty good. It does, in fact, sound to my ears like the click track is the master clock, and that the little push and pull that Ray is doing are secondary to that and are following the pulse, are reacting to the pulse, rather than the pulse or the click reacting to the natural rubato of Ray's original performance. So I'm going to turn the click off now, and what I did is I went in here into Contact and pulled up one of the studio drummer kits. This is vintage drummer, and it was the let's see, yeah, the Ebony Kit Lite. And then I pulled the starting point for a groove out of this Ragtime Dixieland folder, the Big 4 94 beats per minute. Now that's in 4/4 time. I needed to change it to 3/4 time, and I adjusted some of the velocities and tweaked some of it. But that was my starting point for the MIDI. I just clicked and dragged right out to my MIDI track here. And I've got access to the whole library of Studio Drummer of MIDI grooves. So that's where this came from. I just took out this one little 3-beat section, made a loop out of it, and that's my basic drum track. I'll solo that up for just a second. Now you can hear, or it's maybe a little subtle, but I had added a couple of effects to that. By itself, here's the drum tracks that are dry coming out of Contact. Obviously, there's some room sounds, there's some compression EQ in the Contact mixer, but this is how it sounded when I pulled up the preset. So nothing special, but one of the first things that stood out to me about the Ray LaMontagne recording is there's a very prominent tape echo on there, slap echo, and there is either a plate or a spring reverb there. I prefer spring reverbs lately on drums, especially these old-timey Dixieland sounded drums. So I put a spring reverb and a tape echo on there to give it a little pizzazz. You can hear that triplet echo on there. So the two of them together actually end up merging pretty well, I think. So it's not going to win any awards or anything, but to finish a demo up and to get it representing the song as well as possible, this is a great technique for preparing a guide rhythm for an actual live bass player to play over the top of. And perhaps, maybe this is the type of project where you need to, dress up a demo as nice as possible for a label so that you can get, more money for a budget to go have an actual real drummer play those parts. To me, there's no downside to putting a little bit of time into the preparation. If you are going to have real musicians come and play over the top of this, you will more than make up the time that you put into creating this MIDI map, just in the time that you save with them not having to take those 3 or 4 times through the song to rehearse the tempo changes and get a feel for it. You won't have to do nearly as many punch-ins, and in general, I think the session will flow a lot better. Now, if you're not going any farther than just programming some parts in at this point, at least you've got a fairly accurate tempo map. If anything sounds off, rather than going in and adjusting the MIDI notes, you might try going in here and adjusting some of these warp markers. If I go in here and I start moving warp markers around, it will adjust the tempo track in real time rather than me having to go in and conform my MIDI notes to the deviations of the audio. That may, one might be the better solution in one scenario, adjusting the hit points, and adjusting the MIDI timing might be the better solution in another scenario. But at least you've got both of those tools in there. And then if you're sticking in with just program parts, you can at least go in and add some accents here. I put a little cymbal crash on this downbeat here.
Oh, mama, don't.
Just a little something, or you can put a fill every once in a while. Again, these, even if it's just serving as a guide track, having a little fill in the build-up to turnaround can really help a bass player or a guitar player get into the groove and the energy of the song.
Oh, mama, don't leave.
Just little accents like that. So one of the things that you can do if you're not doing your production in Ableton is to... I'm going to go pull a little sample here of perfect. And I need to create a MIDI track here. My skills are failing me here. I thought I could do a simpler instrument. Okay. So I'm just going to pull a sample in here, and then if I go up here on the MIDI track here, I'm going to create a MIDI clip. And duplicate that out and loop this out for my entire song. I am now able to export an audio file, and if I set the selection boundaries to the start and end point of the original recording, and then I do an export choosing this particular audio file as the source for my export, the result will be a click track that that is the precise same number of samples as the source track and will line up right next to it in whatever DAW we use. Then once we have that click track audio, I'm going to go ahead and freeze this real quick. We'll have this audio file that we can use to use the automated features in Nuendo or Cubase or Logic or Pro Tools to analyze these transients and then create a tempo map from these transients. So we have the advantage of being able to use this, what I think is a superior tool of adjusting the warp markers, but we can still generate a transient map, or we could even export a standard MIDI file. There are a variety of ways to get that into the DAW of your choice. But if we export this audio file setting the boundaries from our original track, it will be the exact same number of samples and will lie side by side against the original performance. Now, if you get this far, you may not ever even have to go in and do the MIDI map in Nuendo or whatever DAW you're using, because you could just pipe this out to the drummer's ears or the bass player or the guitar player's ears and have them use this as their click track rather than using the built-in click track function. Anyway, hope that made sense. Hope that helps. And good luck.